Chapter 1, The First War of the Cold War, Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The 38th parallel was the recognized border between the two Koreas after World War II. It is the name that refers to line 38 degrees north of the equator. The Communist military of North Korea crossed this boundary on June 25, 1950. It marked the beginning of the Korean War. The war would be the first open military confrontation of the Cold War, a war that would officially last only 3 years. The war saw several major offensive campaigns. The first came when the North crossed the border. Communist forces pushed all the way to the southern end of the Korean peninsula during that initial invasion. The United States and the Republic of Korea stopped the advance. Then they pushed the Communist military north. This counter-push drove the Communist regime all the way north. The North Koreans were driven nearly to their border with the Republic of China. The Korean War would have ended then, had the Chinese not gotten involved. Their intervention resulted in a successful counterpush by the combined Communist forces. The ROK and U.S. were once again forced back to the southern end of the country. This assault was eventually stopped and pushed back once again. The Communist armies found themselves forced into another retreat. The U.S. and ROK militaries kept them backpedaling until they crossed the 38th parallel. The Communists stopped the advance there. The latter part of the war was fought along the original border. Small gains were made by both sides, only to be repelled back across the border. Back and forth these little skirmishes went. Both sides were heavily dug in along the 38th parallel by the third year of the war. Each had fortified and refortified their defensive positions to stop the other from getting through. Most wars end with an agreed-upon peace treaty. This was not the case in Korea. An armistice agreement was signed July 27, 1953 instead. It was a ceasefire arrangement. It laid out rules for both sides to abide by. The agreement also reestablished the border between the two countries. The new border was determined by the positions both sides held when the agreement was signed. A line down the middle of their positions became the new border. Ironically, this new border was almost the same as the old. It was so close that it continued to be referred to as the 38th parallel. This border was called the Military Demarcation Line. The demilitarized zone is the 2-kilometer area on both the north and south sides of the MDL. Each side patrolled their respective DMZs. The south side conducted day patrols and night ambush patrols. These were done on behalf of the United Nations. The North was patrolling their side to keep their citizens from sneaking south. The North Koreans were constantly sending infiltrators across the border to harass and kill UN patrols. Infiltrators, assassins, spies, and just plain no-good-doers were constantly crossing. Communism was once again on the move in Southeast Asia. Then, things started heating up in Vietnam. 2 U.S. destroyers were in the Gulf of Tonkin near Vietnam in August 1964. The destroyers would be fired upon by North Vietnamese ships. This would be referred to as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. The attack would lead Congress to enact the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This gave President Johnson the authority to use whatever means necessary to ensure peace in the area. The United States would send its first troops to Vietnam in February 1965. Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign, was launched August 13, 1965. This action fully committed the U.S. to the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam would be the second direct confrontation of the Cold War. The battle against communism would be fought in the jungles of Vietnam this time. The following year would see the largest number of draftees since the Korean War. There were 382,010 young men drafted that year. Nobody got out of the draft if your number was drawn. The Army needed every able-bodied person to meet the demands of the war. If a draftee could walk, see, and hold a gun, they were obligated to serve. Typically, recruits were sent to basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. Basic training was 8 weeks long. Trainees graduated and were given 2 weeks' leave. They were then sent to advanced individual training for another 8 weeks. Fort Polk, Louisiana was a primary location for AIT. The heat and humidity helped prepare the trainees for the jungle environment of Vietnam. 18 weeks, and draftees were trained and ready for the war. The buildup of troops for Vietnam in 1966 put a strain on other commitments. Soldiers stationed in Germany and Korea were finishing their assignments and leaving. The Army was sending everyone to Vietnam, so there was no one replacing these soldiers. This created a huge troop shortage in both countries. The troop deficiency was reaching a critical point. It could have impacted the Army's ability to fulfill their mission requirements there. The Army devised a new training cycle to quickly get trainees to Germany and Korea. AIT was reduced to 5 weeks. The units were required to complete the final 3 weeks after they arrived. This reduced the time to 15 weeks to get soldiers to Korea and Germany. The war in Vietnam would impact the Korean Peninsula the most. The Soviet Union, China, and North Koreans knew the United States was heavily committed with troops to the war. Those 3 communist regimes believed the war left the DMZ vulnerable. They increased their aggressiveness in the southern DMZ significantly from 1966 to 1969. Firefights and assaults in the DMZ became a nightly occurrence. Infiltrations into South Korea by spies and assassins increased significantly. The severity of these assaults led this period to be officially designated as the Second Korean War. It is also referred to as the DMZ conflict